It was happened 4 years ago. I don't remember the exact date. I've always been the type to brush off little things that spooked me. That's what you do when you move to a cheap apartment in a rundown part of town. You get used to weird noises, creaky floorboards, and the occasional flicker of the lights. But that first night in apartment 3B, something was different. I'd just signed the lease on a place that seemed too good to be true, a one-bedroom for half what I'd pay anywhere else. The building was old, sure, but I figured it had been around long enough to be structurally sound. The landlord was nice enough, though a little odd. He didn't give me much information about the place except that it was quiet. Too quiet, I thought, but I was desperate. Rent was due, and I didn't have much of a choice. The building had 5 floors, each with 4 apartments. Only a few of the units were occupied, and the place had a strange, empty feeling, like the building was slowly losing its tenants. Mrs. Harper lived on the 2nd floor, and the other tenants were rarely seen. The landlord didn't seem to mind, though, claiming that people came and went all the time in this part of town. I hadn't planned on staying the night. I was just going to drop off a few boxes, unpack a little. But as the sun dipped behind the buildings, I felt something nagging at me, like I should at least spend one night there. Maybe it was just the excitement of moving into my own space. So, I locked the door behind me, flipped on a lamp, and settled in. The silence in the apartment was suffocating. I tried to distract myself by unpacking more boxes, but every little sound felt amplified in the quiet. Scratches on the wall, creaks in the floorboards, the faint hum of the fridge. But it wasn't until I turned off the light and crawled into bed that the real weirdness started. At first it was subtle, a soft thud, like something had fallen in the apartment above me. I told myself it was just the building settling. But then, there it was again. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, pacing. I froze, my body stiffening under the covers. The steps were getting closer, each one louder than the last. Heavy boots? I didn't know, but they were unmistakable. Pacing, back and forth, back and forth. "Could you please stop making that noise?" I shouted, my voice trembling. "I'm trying to sleep." The footsteps stopped. The sudden silence was almost worse than the noise itself. I let out a shaky breath, my heart still racing, but at least the pacing had ceased. I figured it was just my mind playing tricks, the stress of the move getting to me. I tried to sleep, but my thoughts kept racing. The stillness in the apartment felt too thick, like something was watching me. I tossed and turned, but sleep wouldn't come. Then, after a while, the sound started again. Slowly at first, just a few thuds, and then the pacing began, back and forth, louder than before. I sat up in bed, gasping. "Please, stop. Just stop it." But this time the footsteps didn't stop. They kept going, echoing through the apartment. I jammed my hands over my ears, but that didn't help. I grabbed a pillow and stuffed it over my head, but it was no use. The sound was deafening. The pacing continued, relentless and unending. I tried turning on music, cranking up the volume, but it couldn't drown out the steps above me. I kept glancing at the clock. 2:45 a.m., 3 a.m. I just wanted to sleep, to escape the nightmare, but it felt impossible. The pacing seemed to go on forever, a constant reminder that I wasn't alone in this building. The next morning, I woke up feeling like I hadn't slept at all. My head was pounding, and my body felt heavy, as if I'd been running all night. I grabbed my phone and texted Mrs. Harper, asking if she had heard anything strange in the building recently. But there was no answer. I stepped out into the hallway, trying to shake off the lingering dread. I knocked on a few doors, asking the other tenants if they'd heard anything unusual, but no one seemed to know what I was talking about. One tenant muttered something about noise problems, but didn't seem too concerned. Another looked at me like I was crazy. But when I spoke to Mrs. Harper later that afternoon, her reaction was different. Her face darkened as soon as I mentioned the footsteps. "You heard them too?" she asked quietly, glancing around as if someone might be listening. "It's been happening for years, ever since he died." I frowned. "Who died?" Mrs. Harper looked uncomfortable, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "The man who lived above you. He used to pace the floor like that every night. Then one night he just didn't come down. We called the cops, but they found him upstairs, dead. But the footsteps didn't stop. People thought it was just the building settling. But I know better." I shivered, the pieces starting to fall into place. The footsteps weren't just a noise, they were a part of this building's dark history. And now, they were a part of mine too. That night, I couldn't bring myself to stay in the apartment. I packed up some things, got in my car, and drove out of the city. By the end of the week, I was a wreck. I moved out, found a new place, and tried to forget about 3B. But every night, when I close my eyes, I hear it, the sound of footsteps pacing above me. The terror never leaves. It's still there, always lurking in the back of my mind. But even now, months later, I can still hear the sound of those footsteps echoing in my head. And sometimes, in the dead of night, I wonder if they'll follow me wherever I go. This happened a few years ago when I was 27, living in apartment 4C in a small, aging building on the outskirts of town. The rent was cheap, which should have been my first red flag. The building had poor lighting, broken security cameras, and a landlord who never seemed to be around when you needed him. But I was young, just starting out, and it felt like the best I could afford at the time. At first, everything seemed normal. It wasn't a glamorous building, but it wasn't dangerous either. At least, that's what I told myself. The neighbors were quiet, and the halls always seemed empty, as if the place was slowly fading into itself. But then, it started. Little things at first, my mail disappearing, things slightly moved around in my apartment when I was sure I'd left them in place, a faint sound of shuffling outside my door in the middle of the night. I thought maybe it was the building settling, or just me being paranoid. I'd lived alone before, but this was different. There was a feeling of being watched, a feeling that something wasn't right. Then, I started seeing him. It wasn't immediate. The first few times I noticed him, I thought he was just another tenant. He was in his 50s, tall with a dark coat and a baseball cap pulled low over his face. He'd be standing at the end of the hallway, sometimes just staring at the wall, sometimes mumbling to himself. I figured he lived somewhere in the building. It was a small place, and maybe he was just one of those quiet residents you didn't really see often. But after a few days of this, I began to feel uneasy. He didn't seem to go into any apartment. He'd just stand there, motionless, for hours. One evening, I ran into Mrs. Kelly, who lived on the second floor. I'd seen her around, always with a smile and a quick word. I casually mentioned the man I'd been seeing in the hallway, and her reaction was immediate. "You mean the tall guy in the coat?" she asked, her face going pale. "You need to be careful, honey. He doesn't live here." I froze. "What do you mean?" Her voice dropped to a whisper. "I've seen him too, for months now. I think he's been getting in through the back entrance. The lock's been broken for weeks, and the landlord won't fix it. I've called the police twice, but by the time they show up, he's always gone." I felt my stomach drop. He doesn't live here. That night I couldn't sleep. Around 2 a.m. I heard the footsteps, slow, deliberate, coming closer to my door. I held my breath, straining to listen. They stopped right outside. My heart pounded as I crept to the peephole. I could see him, just standing there, facing my door. His body stiff, his head slightly tilted. not moving, not making a sound. I grabbed my phone to call 911, but when I looked back through the peephole, he was gone. I didn't feel safe anymore. I installed a doorbell camera the next morning, determined to catch whatever was happening. The footage I got was disturbing. Every night, between 1 and 3 a.m., he'd show up. Sometimes he'd stand in front of my door, just staring. Other times trying the door handles, even putting his ear against the wood as if listening for something. The next day, I took the footage to the police. The officer's expression went grim as he watched the clips. "That's Dennis Walsh," he said after a long pause. "We've been tracking him for years. He's been arrested multiple times for breaking and entering, trespassing, stalking. He's fixated on apartment buildings." I felt a cold wave of panic wash over me. "What does he want?" The officer looked uncomfortable. "Women who live alone. He watches them, learns their routines." And then he paused. "We've had reports of him stealing underwear from laundry rooms, taking pictures through windows. Last year, he escalated to attempted break-ins." I could barely breathe. "Why hasn't he been stopped?" "We can't arrest him for just standing in the hallway." "But he's smart. He disappears before we can catch him. But this footage, this might be enough." That night, I stayed at a friend's place. I couldn't bear to be in the apartment, knowing he was still out there, lurking in the halls. The next morning, Mrs. Kelly called me. Her voice was frantic. "He tried to break into 2C last night, Emily's apartment. She's the young nurse who works the night shift. He must have thought she wasn't home, but she came back early and surprised him. He ran, but she got a good look at his face." 2 days later, the police arrested Dennis Walsh. They found a notebook in his possession, filled with detailed information about several women across multiple apartment buildings, including mine. My name was in there. So was Emily's. Mrs. Kelly's niece, who visited on weekends, was also mentioned, along with neighbors' schedules, their cars, everything. It turned out that Dennis had been using the broken back entrance to sneak in and out of the building for months. Not just ours, but several others. He'd watch, take notes, and even steal personal items, photos, clothing, keys. The police found a storage unit full of stuff he'd taken. Bras, photographs, used tissues. Small, intimate items that made my skin crawl. The worst part? In his notebook, next to my name, he had written, "Lives alone, gets home around 6 p.m., leaves door unlocked when getting mail, kitchen window visible from alley." He had been watching me, learning my habits, planning something. I don't even want to think about what might have happened if I hadn't caught the footage. I moved out 2 weeks later. I couldn't stay in that apartment, knowing how close I had come to becoming another one of his victims. The landlord finally fixed the broken back door lock, but only after the police threatened to fine him for security violations. Dennis Walsh is back in prison now, but the scariest part wasn't the broken locks or the stolen items. It was knowing how easily he had slipped into my life without me even realizing. The real monsters aren't always ghosts or supernatural forces. Sometimes they're people who walk among us, watching and waiting for the right moment to strike. This happened a few years ago when I was 28. I had just moved into a one-bedroom apartment on the 3rd floor of an old building near the edge of the city. It wasn't glamorous by any means. Thin walls, outdated appliances, and a strange smell that lingered in the hallway. But the rent was affordable, and it was the best I could get after a messy breakup and a job that barely covered my bills. I didn't know much about the building when I signed the lease. The landlord was nice enough, but a bit odd, kept to himself, didn't ask many questions. The building itself was a 4-story structure with 12 apartments in total, 3 apartments per floor, and the tenants were a mix of young professionals, families, and some older folks. The building was clean, but it felt a bit tired, like it had been neglected for a while. For the first few days, everything seemed fine. I spent my nights unpacking and adjusting to the new place. But soon after I got settled in, something started to feel off. It wasn't anything specific, just a general sense of unease that lingered in the background. The first sign was the noise. At night, I would hear faint knocking sounds from the hallway. Soft at first, like someone tapping on a door. Then it would stop. I thought maybe it was just the building settling or the neighbors. But then it started happening more regularly, around 1 or 2 a.m. It was never loud, but it was distinct enough to wake me up, making me wonder if someone was outside my door. The real turning point came about 2 weeks after I moved in. One night, I was getting ready for bed when I heard the sound again, a soft knocking at my door. I froze, expecting it to stop after a few seconds, like it usually did. But it didn't. The knocking continued, slowly, methodically, as if someone was testing the door. I checked the peephole, but I couldn't see anything in the dark hallway. Just a faint shadow at the corner of my door. I waited a moment before I opened it, only to find no one there. Confused, I stepped into the hallway to look around. I saw no one. The hall was empty, and there was no one else's door visibly disturbed. But when I looked down, I saw something strange. The door to apartment 3A was slightly ajar, and the faint light inside flickered like someone had just passed through it. I figured it was just an oversight, and maybe the tenants had left it open accidentally. But something about it felt wrong. I quickly shut my door and locked it, pushing the thought to the back of my mind. The next night, I decided to stay up late, just to see if the noise would happen again. Around 1 a.m., I heard it. Quiet knocking, as if it were coming from the door next to mine. It wasn't the same gentle tapping as before. This time, it was harder, almost frantic. I jumped out of bed, heart racing, and checked the peephole. To my shock, I saw the door to 3A wide open. No light, no sound, just darkness. I grabbed my phone and went to knock on the door, but as soon as I touched the handle, it felt like my heart stopped. There was something strange about the silence. No sounds from within, no voices, not even a creak from the floorboards. I knocked lightly, but no response. I stepped back, unsure of what to do. Was I imagining things? I had never even met the tenant of 3A. The apartment had been vacant when I moved in, but I figured someone must have moved in by now. Maybe the previous tenant left things behind and that was why the door was ajar. But as I turned to walk back to my apartment, the lights flickered in the hallway, and I heard a soft creak, like footsteps. Someone walking through the hallway. I hurried back to my apartment, locked the door, and tried to brush it off as my mind playing tricks on me. But that night, as I lay in bed, I heard something else. A faint whispering, as if someone was talking in the hallway right outside my door. The next morning, I couldn't take it anymore. I knocked on the door to 3A, but no one answered. I asked around, and the tenants in the building told me the same thing. They hadn't seen anyone moving in. They hadn't heard any noise from 3A either, and no one had ever mentioned a new neighbor. The landlord wasn't much help either. He seemed nervous when I asked about it, but he gave me some vague excuse about the building being in transition and that the previous tenants of 3A had been late on their rent. I didn't press him any further, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Something about the building felt off, like something was watching me. A week later, I woke up to the sound of a loud bang at 3 a.m. The knocking had started again, only this time it was coming from inside my apartment. I sat straight up, frozen in fear. I quickly grabbed my phone and called the police, thinking someone had broken in. But when they arrived, they found nothing, no sign of forced entry, nothing out of place. The knocking never stopped. I couldn't sleep. I started to notice things, objects being out of place, the eerie silence in the hallways, and the strange way 3 a.m. door would always be slightly ajar, no matter how many times I checked it. It was as if something, or someone, was trying to get in or out, but never did. One afternoon, I decided to leave the building for good. I couldn't live with the constant dread. But as I was packing, I got one last look at the hallway. This time, the door to 3A wasn't ajar. It was wide open, and the air smelled stale, like it hadn't been ventilated in years. Inside, I could see a shadow moving, just beyond the edge of my vision. And then, the door slammed shut. I couldn't get out of that building fast enough. I moved into a new place a week later. I don't know who or what was living in apartment 3A, but I know one thing. I never want to go back to that building.